Have you ever stopped to consider that one of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to improve their blood sugar may be focusing too much on what they need to remove from their diet rather than asking what they should begin adding? For years, many people have been taught to fear carbohydrates, avoid them whenever possible, and assume that eliminating them is the only reliable path toward better glucose control. But after years of caring for patients, I can tell you that meaningful and lasting change usually does not begin with removing entire categories of food. It begins with understanding how certain foods can work with your body's own biology. Some of the most encouraging improvements I have seen have come not from extreme restriction, but from strategically adding foods that support metabolism, insulin function, and healthier glucose regulation. I have seen hundreds of people make a few carefully chosen additions to their meals and notice their blood sugar readings begin moving in a healthier direction within days. Even more importantly, many were able to maintain those improvements for months, and, in some cases, years, while reducing their dependence on medication under the careful supervision of their physicians. That is exactly what I want to explore with you today. We are going to look at 10 remarkable foods that can support your body's natural ability to regulate blood sugar. Each one works through a somewhat different biological pathway. Some slow the movement of glucose into the bloodstream. Others help calm the chronic inflammation that interferes with insulin signaling. And several may help your cells respond more effectively to the insulin your body is already producing. The objective is not simply to push your blood sugar lower for a few days. The real goal is to create metabolic improvements that are practical, sustainable, and capable of becoming part of your everyday life. Before we get into the science, I have one small request. If you enjoy understanding what is actually happening inside your body, rather than simply being told which medication to take, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing your fasting blood sugar from this week in the comments. I genuinely pay attention to those comments, and the ages, questions, and experiences you share help shape the subjects I discuss in future videos. My goal is to focus on the questions that matter most to people who are dealing with these metabolic challenges every day. Now, there is something about elevated blood sugar that often receives very little attention during a short medical appointment. High blood sugar does not usually begin simply because you ate something sweet. In many cases, the deeper problem involves a hormone called insulin. Think of insulin as a biological messenger carrying a key. Its job is to communicate with your cells and essentially unlock the pathway that allows glucose, the sugar circulating through your bloodstream, to move inside those cells where it can be used to produce energy. When your metabolism is functioning well, this process happens continuously, every hour of every day. But over time, repeated glucose spikes, highly processed foods, inadequate sleep, chronic stress, and ongoing metabolic strain can gradually change the way your cells respond. Insulin may continue sending the signal, but the cells become less responsive to it. This condition is known as insulin resistance. Your pancreas then tries to compensate by producing more insulin, essentially increasing the strength of the message in an effort to persuade your cells to take in glucose. But despite all that additional insulin, blood sugar can continue rising. At that point, treatment often involves medications designed to increase insulin activity or otherwise help bring glucose levels down. That does not mean anyone is trying to keep you unhealthy. It reflects the way modern healthcare has developed. Medical visits are often short, prescriptions can be written quickly, and there may not be enough time to explain the extraordinary biochemical conversation taking place between your food, your hormones, your liver, your muscles, and your cells. Yet that conversation is incredibly important. Understanding it can give you another powerful tool for improving your metabolic health. And today, I want to take the time to explain that biology in a way that many people simply never get the opportunity to hear during a routine appointment. Every food we are going to discuss today serves at least one of three important purposes. Some slow the rate at which glucose enters your bloodstream. Others help reduce the low-grade inflammation that can interfere with the way your cells respond to insulin. and some may directly support insulin signaling, allowing your body to use the insulin it already produces more efficiently. The encouraging part is that you do not have to completely redesign your diet overnight. There is no reason to wake up tomorrow and try to transform every meal you eat. A more practical approach is to introduce these foods gradually over the next several weeks. As each food becomes part of your routine, the effects can begin to complement one another. Over time, those small changes may become much more meaningful than any single food could accomplish on its own. So let's begin with the first one. The first food may surprise you because it is often overlooked, despite being inexpensive, accessible, and remarkably interesting from a metabolic perspective. I am talking about fenugreek seeds. These small, golden brown seeds can be found in the spice section of many grocery stores, and their appearance gives very little indication of the biological activity they contain. One of the reasons fenugreek has attracted so much attention is its unusually high concentration of a soluble fiber known as galactomannan. When these seeds come into contact with water inside your digestive tract, that fiber absorbs fluid and expands into a thick, gel-like material. This may sound simple, but the physical effect is important. The gel can slow the movement of food through the digestive system and reduce the speed at which carbohydrates are broken down and absorbed. Instead of a large amount of glucose entering your bloodstream rapidly after a meal, the release can become slower and more gradual. That means your blood sugar may rise less sharply, creating a more controlled metabolic response. And when glucose enters the bloodstream more gradually, your pancreas does not have to respond with the same kind of sudden insulin surge. In that sense, fenugreek is not simply acting on blood sugar itself. It is influencing the speed at which the entire digestive process delivers glucose to your circulation. Fenugreek also contains other naturally occurring compounds that have been studied for their potential effects on insulin secretion and glucose uptake by tissues such as muscle. So its potential value involves more than one pathway. It may help moderate the arrival of glucose while also supporting the body's ability to handle that glucose once it is circulating. Over the years, I have seen patients incorporate fenugreek into their routines and report improvements in their fasting glucose measurements within the first several days or weeks. Of course, individual responses vary, and no single food works identically for everyone. But the consistency with which fenugreek has been studied for glucose management makes it an interesting addition for people who are trying to improve insulin sensitivity through nutrition. Using it is relatively simple. One traditional approach is to measure about 1 teaspoon of whole fenugreek seeds and place them in a glass of water before going to bed. Allow them to soak overnight so the seeds soften and the soluble fiber can absorb water. In the morning, some people drink the soaking water and then consume the softened seeds before breakfast. If the slightly bitter flavor is difficult for you, another option is to grind the seeds into a powder and use a smaller amount in plain yogurt, oatmeal, eggs, or another protein-rich breakfast. If you have never consumed much fenugreek before, start with a smaller quantity rather than immediately using a large amount. Its fiber content can be quite substantial, and your digestive system may need some time to adjust. The second food is probably already sitting somewhere in your kitchen. But there is an important distinction that many people never hear about. Not every type of cinnamon is the same. The variety commonly found in many supermarkets is known as cassia cinnamon. It has a familiar warm flavor and can certainly be used in cooking, but it naturally contains a compound called coumarin. In small culinary amounts, this is generally not a major concern for most people. However, consuming large amounts of cassia cinnamon every day over an extended period can expose you to more coumarin than is desirable, particularly because the compound can place stress on the liver. That is why, when people want to use cinnamon regularly, I prefer to point them toward another variety. Look for Ceylon cinnamon, which is sometimes called true cinnamon. It has a lighter, more delicate flavor and contains substantially less coumarin, making it a more suitable choice for regular use. What makes cinnamon especially interesting is not simply its taste. It contains a variety of plant compounds, including polyphenols, that have been investigated for their ability to influence glucose metabolism and insulin signaling. To understand why this matters, imagine the insulin receptor on the surface of a cell as a tiny biological lock. When insulin arrives with its message, that receptor needs to respond appropriately so glucose can move from the bloodstream into the cell. With insulin resistance, that communication becomes less efficient. The message is present, but the response is weaker. Certain compounds found in cinnamon appear to support aspects of this signaling process, potentially helping cells respond more effectively to insulin. Cinnamon may also slow the rate at which food is digested and glucose becomes available after a meal, which can contribute to a steadier rise in blood sugar rather than a rapid spike. That combination makes this familiar kitchen spice much more interesting from a metabolic standpoint than most people realize. Research has investigated these effects in people with type 2 diabetes and has found that modest amounts of cinnamon may produce improvements in measures of blood glucose, although the results across studies are not perfectly uniform. So I would never describe cinnamon as a replacement for medical treatment. But as part of an overall healthy eating pattern, it can be a simple habit worth considering. If you already have cinnamon in your kitchen, you may not need to make a dramatic change. A practical amount is roughly 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon per day. You can stir it into oatmeal, add it to a smoothie, or mix it into coffee if you enjoy the flavor. I particularly like the idea of pairing it with a meal that contains carbohydrates because that is when supporting a steadier glucose response becomes especially relevant. It is a small nutritional adjustment, but it works alongside your body's normal physiology rather than requiring you to completely eliminate the foods you enjoy. The third food deserves even more attention because it is one of the most overlooked items in this entire conversation. I am talking about broccoli sprouts, not mature broccoli. That distinction is important. These tiny young sprouts, particularly when they are only a few days old, can contain dramatically higher concentrations of a compound called sulforaphane than fully mature broccoli. In some analyses, the difference can be many times greater, which means that simply assuming broccoli and broccoli sprouts provide identical amounts of these compounds would cause you to miss an important nutritional distinction. Sulforaphane is especially interesting because it may influence one of the less obvious contributors to elevated fasting blood sugar, and that is your liver. While you sleep, your liver is supposed to release glucose into your bloodstream. This is not a mistake. It is an essential biological process that helps provide your brain and other tissues with a steady supply of energy during the hours when you are not eating. The problem arises when insulin resistance changes the signals controlling that process. In people with metabolic dysfunction, the liver can release more glucose than the body actually requires. That extra glucose can contribute to the surprisingly high fasting readings many people see first thing in the morning. They may wake up thinking, "I have not eaten anything all night, so why is my blood sugar still high?" The answer may partly involve what your liver has been doing while you were asleep. This is where sulforaphane becomes particularly interesting. Research has explored concentrated sulforaphane preparations in people with type 2 diabetes, including studies conducted by researchers in Sweden, and some findings have shown reductions in fasting blood glucose, with potentially greater effects among individuals whose glucose control was more difficult. These findings are encouraging, although it is important to remember that research on concentrated extracts is not necessarily identical to eating ordinary broccoli sprouts, and nutrition should always be viewed within the context of the larger metabolic picture. Still, adding broccoli sprouts to meals is simple and inexpensive. You can grow them yourself in a jar on your kitchen counter, or look for fresh sprouts in the produce section of some grocery stores. A small handful several times a week can be an easy way to include them in your diet. Try adding them to salads, sandwiches, wraps, or grain bowls. One important consideration is preparation. High temperatures can reduce the availability of some of the compounds involved in sulforaphane formation, so eating broccoli sprouts raw or only lightly heated can help preserve more of their potential nutritional value. And notice the pattern developing here. We are not talking about extreme diets. We are not talking about starving yourself or eliminating every carbohydrate from your plate. We are looking at different foods that interact with different parts of your metabolic system. Fenugreek can help slow the delivery of glucose from your digestive tract. Cinnamon may support insulin signaling. Broccoli sprouts provide compounds that may influence pathways involved in inflammation and glucose regulation, including processes taking place in the liver. Each food approaches the problem from a different direction. And that is precisely why I find this strategy so interesting. Your metabolism is not controlled by a single switch. It is an interconnected biological system involving your gut, pancreas, liver, muscles, blood vessels, hormones, and countless cellular signals. When we choose foods that support several of those systems at the same time, we can begin working with the body's natural design instead of constantly fighting against it. And remarkably, we have only covered the first 3 foods. The next foods are even easier to incorporate because many of them can become part of meals you may already be eating. Small changes at breakfast, lunch, and dinner can make a meaningful difference without leaving you feeling deprived. And if someone you care about is also trying to improve their glucose levels or manage insulin resistance, this is information worth sharing with them. Understanding the biology behind food can completely change the way you think about what belongs on your plate. Because the goal is not simply to eat less. The goal is to give your body better information through the foods you choose. The 4th food is avocado, and this is one that I often find people avoiding for the wrong reason. They see the calorie content and immediately assume that because an avocado contains fat, it must be something they should limit. But that way of thinking misses a very important distinction between different types of dietary fat and how those fats interact with the rest of your meal. Most of the fat in an avocado is monounsaturated fat, the same general category of heart-supportive fat found in foods such as extra virgin olive oil. And when you combine that healthy fat with avocado's substantial fiber content, something interesting happens to the way your body handles the rest of your meal. Imagine that you are eating a meal containing rice, potatoes, bread, or another carbohydrate-rich food. Without much fiber, fat, or protein accompanying those carbohydrates, digestion can proceed relatively quickly, allowing glucose to enter your bloodstream in a short period of time. Your blood sugar rises, your pancreas responds by releasing insulin, and then your glucose may fall again after the initial rise. But adding a food like avocado changes the physical environment in your digestive system. The combination of fiber and monounsaturated fat can slow the overall digestion and absorption of the meal, helping glucose enter the bloodstream at a more gradual rate. Instead of asking your pancreas to deal with a sudden flood of glucose, you are giving your body a slower and more manageable delivery. That can mean a smaller post-meal rise and a more stable metabolic response. There is another reason I particularly like avocado as part of a blood sugar-friendly eating pattern. Its effects are not limited to the few hours immediately after you eat it. Diets that contain appropriate amounts of monounsaturated fats have been associated with improvements in insulin sensitivity, meaning that cells can become more responsive to insulin and may not require as much of the hormone to manage the same amount of glucose. That is an important concept, because insulin resistance is not simply about having too much sugar in your bloodstream. It is also about the cells becoming less efficient at listening to insulin's message. Improving that communication can make glucose regulation much easier. And there is a practical advantage to avocado that should not be underestimated. It is highly satisfying. When your meal contains enough fiber and healthy fat to keep you full, you are less likely to become hungry again an hour later and reach for cookies, chips, pastries, or another processed snack. That secondary effect can be just as important as the food itself. Sometimes improving blood sugar is not about finding a magical ingredient. It is about creating meals that keep you satisfied long enough that you naturally make fewer unhealthy choices later in the day. A practical serving could be around half an avocado. You can slice it over eggs in the morning, add it to salad at lunch, or use it alongside a carbohydrate source such as whole grain toast. You can also combine it with vegetables and a protein source to create a meal that contains several nutrients working together. And this is the larger principle I want you to remember. You do not necessarily have to eliminate carbohydrates to improve your glucose response. Sometimes the better strategy is to change what you eat alongside them. Instead of removing the toast, for example, you might add avocado and eggs. Instead of eating a bowl of rice by itself, you might combine a smaller portion with vegetables, protein, and healthy fat. You are not simply taking food away. You are changing the biological context in which your body processes that food. The fifth food is chia seeds. They are tiny, but from a nutritional standpoint, they are remarkably concentrated. And if you have ever placed chia seeds into water and watched them transform into a thick, almost pudding-like mixture, you have already seen the mechanism that makes them particularly interesting for blood sugar regulation. That same transformation occurs inside your digestive tract. Chia seeds are exceptionally rich in soluble fiber. When that fiber encounters liquid in your stomach, it absorbs water and forms a gel-like structure. That gel can slow the movement and digestion of carbohydrates within the meal. As a result, glucose is released into the bloodstream more gradually instead of appearing all at once. This matters because rapid glucose rises can create rapid insulin responses, and repeated large swings in glucose and insulin are not ideal for someone already dealing with insulin resistance. A slower release gives your body more time to process the incoming glucose. It creates a smoother metabolic curve rather than a sharp peak followed by a sudden decline. That can also influence how you feel. Many people recognize the familiar pattern of eating a carbohydrate-heavy breakfast, feeling energetic briefly, and then becoming hungry, tired, or intensely interested in another sugary snack a couple of hours later. Part of that cycle can be related to how quickly the meal was digested and how rapidly glucose and insulin changed afterward. Fiber-rich foods such as chia seeds can help create a more gradual response. But chia seeds offer another feature that makes them particularly valuable. They provide plant-based omega-3 fatty acids, primarily in the form of alpha-linolenic acid. These fats are not identical to the EPA and DHA found in fatty fish, but they still contribute to an overall dietary pattern associated with cardiovascular and metabolic health. This matters because insulin resistance and chronic low-grade inflammation often exist together. Inflammatory signals can interfere with the communication pathways that allow insulin to tell your cells what to do. When that communication becomes less efficient, glucose has a harder time moving out of the bloodstream and into tissues that need it for energy. So, supporting a healthier inflammatory environment is another piece of the larger metabolic puzzle. Chia seeds are also extremely easy to use. You can start with 1 to 2 tablespoons a day and add them to yogurt, oatmeal, smoothies, or other meals. Some people prefer mixing them into water, perhaps with a little fresh lemon, and allowing them to sit for several minutes before drinking. Giving the seeds time to absorb liquid allows the characteristic gel to form before they reach your digestive system. If you increase your fiber intake, however, remember that hydration matters. Your body needs enough fluid for fiber to move comfortably through the digestive tract. So do not suddenly add large amounts of fiber while ignoring your water intake. Introduce chia gradually and give your digestive system time to adjust. The sixth food takes us in a different direction. Instead of primarily slowing carbohydrate digestion, this food group addresses one of the underlying conditions that can make insulin resistance worse in the first place. I am talking about fatty fish, particularly salmon and mackerel. Chronic inflammation is one of the important biological factors associated with reduced insulin sensitivity. When inflammatory signals remain elevated for long periods, they can interfere with normal communication between insulin and your cells. The result is that glucose can remain in the bloodstream longer because the tissues are not responding as effectively to insulin's message. Fatty fish provide two particularly important omega-3 fatty acids, known as EPA and DHA. These have been extensively studied for their roles in cardiovascular health, inflammatory regulation, and cellular function. They become part of cell membranes and can influence the way those membranes behave and communicate. This is particularly relevant because insulin signaling ultimately depends on a series of highly coordinated processes occurring at the cellular level. A healthier cellular environment can support more efficient communication between insulin and the tissues that need to respond to it. Over many years of clinical observation, I have repeatedly noticed that people who regularly include fatty fish as part of an overall healthy diet tend to have a better metabolic profile than those who rarely consume it. Of course, we should be careful not to attribute every health benefit to one food. People who eat more fish may also have other healthy habits, and nutrition studies cannot always separate one factor from everything else a person does. But the biological evidence supporting omega-3 rich fish is strong enough that fatty fish deserves a regular place in a balanced diet. A practical goal is around 2 servings each week. A serving can be approximately the size of the palm of your hand, depending on your individual nutritional needs. Salmon is an excellent choice, but it is certainly not the only option. Mackerel, sardines, and herring can also provide substantial amounts of omega-3 fats. And there is an important advantage that often gets overlooked. You do not need to buy the most expensive fresh fish to benefit from this category of food. Canned sardines and canned mackerel can be remarkably affordable while still providing protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and other valuable nutrients. For people trying to improve metabolic health without dramatically increasing their grocery budget, that makes them particularly practical. You can bake fish, grill it, add it to salads, or use canned varieties in simple meals. The key is consistency rather than perfection. Eating fatty fish once every few months is very different from making it a regular part of your weekly routine. And when you look at the larger picture, that consistency is what matters most. We are not searching for one meal that suddenly transforms your metabolism. We are building a pattern that your body can experience repeatedly. The 7th food is walnuts. Among the many types of nuts available, walnuts are one of the first foods I think about when discussing metabolic and cardiovascular health together. That is because they can support more than one system at the same time. They provide healthy fats, plant protein, fiber, and a variety of bioactive compounds, all within a relatively small serving. And their relationship with blood vessel health is especially interesting. The delicate inner lining of your blood vessels is called the endothelium. This layer is not simply passive plumbing. It is a living biological organ that responds to hormones, nutrients, inflammation, blood flow, and metabolic signals. Persistent high blood sugar can place stress on this system over time. That is one reason glucose management and vascular health are so closely connected. Walnuts contain polyunsaturated fats, including the plant-based omega-3 fatty acid alpha-linolenic acid. These fats can contribute to healthier blood vessel function as part of an overall balanced diet. At the same time, walnuts provide fiber and protein, which can slow digestion and contribute to a more stable response after eating. This combination makes them a much better choice than many processed snack foods. There is also evidence that regular nut consumption, including walnuts, is associated with improved markers of metabolic health in some populations. Again, this does not mean walnuts are a medication or that eating them guarantees a particular blood sugar result. But they fit remarkably well into a dietary pattern designed to support insulin sensitivity, cardiovascular health, and satiety. One of the easiest ways to use walnuts is to make them a replacement rather than simply an addition. That distinction is important. If you eat cookies and then add walnuts afterward, you have not really changed the nutritional quality of the snack very much. But if you replace the cookies with a small handful of walnuts, you have completely changed what your body receives. Instead of refined flour and added sugar, you are providing healthy fats, protein, fiber, minerals, and plant compounds that can help keep you satisfied. A reasonable serving is around 1/4 cup, or roughly a small handful. Choose raw or dry roasted walnuts when possible, and avoid versions heavily coated with sugar, honey, candy, or other sweet toppings. The purpose is to allow the nutritional qualities of the walnut to work for you rather than turning it into a dessert. The eighth food is eggs, and here I mean the whole egg, including the yolk. For decades, people were encouraged to view egg yolks primarily through the lens of dietary cholesterol. That led many people to replace eggs with foods that appeared healthier because they were labeled low-fat, but were often loaded with refined carbohydrates and added sugar. Sugary cereals, pastries, sweetened breakfast products, and highly processed toast toppings could end up producing a much greater glucose burden than a whole egg ever would. Today, our understanding of dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular risk is much more nuanced. And from a blood sugar perspective, eggs have a particularly useful nutritional profile. They contain high-quality protein and fat while providing very little carbohydrate. That means a whole egg has minimal direct impact on blood glucose compared with a carbohydrate-heavy breakfast. Instead of giving you a rapid glucose surge, eggs provide protein and other nutrients that can contribute to lasting fullness. And this brings us to a fascinating concept known as the second meal effect. What you eat at one meal can influence the way your body responds to the meal that comes afterward. Breakfast, in other words, does not necessarily end when you finish breakfast. The metabolic consequences can continue into lunchtime. When someone begins the morning with a protein-rich meal containing whole eggs instead of a highly refined carbohydrate breakfast, their glucose response to a later meal may be more favorable. This can happen because protein, fat, and overall meal composition influence digestion, appetite, and insulin responses throughout the day. The practical benefit is that a satisfying breakfast may also make it easier to avoid the mid-morning cravings that lead many people toward muffins, cookies, pastries, or vending machine snacks. And that is another example of why food should be viewed as a system rather than as isolated ingredients. A breakfast that keeps you satisfied can influence what you eat several hours later. Over the years, replacing highly processed breakfast foods with eggs has become one of the simplest dietary changes I discuss with people who want a more stable morning glucose pattern. Eggs are affordable, versatile, and easy to prepare in advance. You can scramble them, boil them, make an omelet with vegetables, or prepare them ahead of time for a quick breakfast on busy mornings. And if you combine eggs with avocado, as we discussed earlier, you create a meal containing protein, healthy fats, fiber, and very little refined carbohydrate. That is a very different metabolic starting point from a breakfast built around sugary cereal or pastries. The ninth food is apple cider vinegar. This one is particularly interesting because its effect can sometimes be observed relatively quickly, especially by people who monitor their glucose at home. The key compound in vinegar is acetic acid. It appears to influence blood sugar through more than one mechanism. One involves slowing the rate at which food leaves the stomach, which can give carbohydrates more time to be digested and absorbed gradually. Another involves the way muscles handle glucose after a meal. When your muscles are able to take up glucose efficiently, less sugar remains circulating in your bloodstream. Some controlled research has found that vinegar, consumed with or before a carbohydrate-containing meal, can reduce the size of the post-meal glucose rise, particularly in people with impaired glucose regulation. That is an interesting finding because the intervention is inexpensive and very simple. But simple does not mean that it is appropriate for everyone. If you decide to use apple cider vinegar, dilution is essential. Never drink concentrated vinegar straight. The acidity can irritate your throat and, with repeated exposure, contribute to erosion of the protective enamel on your teeth. A common approach is to mix approximately 1 tablespoon with a full glass of water and consume it before a carbohydrate-containing meal. Some people prefer to start with a smaller amount to see how their digestive system responds. And there is one safety point I want to emphasize very clearly. If you take medication that lowers blood sugar, particularly insulin or medicines that can cause hypoglycemia, do not assume that adding vinegar is automatically harmless simply because it is a food. If your glucose is already being lowered by medication, adding additional strategies that improve glucose handling could potentially push your blood sugar lower than expected. That is why it is important to discuss regular use with your healthcare professional and monitor your readings rather than making medication changes on your own. The 10th and final food brings us back to one of the most important messages of this entire discussion. Carbohydrates themselves are not necessarily the enemy. Lentils are a carbohydrate-rich food, yet they can fit remarkably well into a blood sugar-friendly diet. The reason has to do with the structure of the carbohydrate and what accompanies it. Lentils contain resistant starch, substantial soluble fiber, and a significant amount of plant protein. These components slow digestion and change the speed at which glucose becomes available to the bloodstream. Instead of a rapid flood of glucose, you get a much more gradual release that can continue over several hours. That slower digestion can also contribute to greater satiety, making it easier to maintain a healthy eating pattern without constantly feeling hungry. Lentils can also contribute to the kind of second meal effect we discussed with eggs. A high-fiber, minimally processed meal can influence how your body responds to food later in the day, helping create a more stable metabolic pattern. From a clinical and nutritional perspective, replacing refined carbohydrates such as white rice or highly processed potato products with legumes like lentils is a strategy worth considering for people trying to improve long-term glucose control. The important point is not that lentils magically lower blood sugar. It is that their nutritional structure allows them to behave very differently from refined carbohydrates. A practical serving might be around 1/2 to 1 cup of cooked lentils, depending on your individual nutritional requirements. You can use them in soups, stews, salads, or as a replacement for part of the rice or other refined starch on your plate. You can even combine them with extra virgin olive oil, vegetables, herbs, and a small amount of vinegar to create a meal that is both satisfying and metabolically supportive. And when you look at all 10 foods together, something important becomes clear. The strategy is not about creating a diet where every carbohydrate disappears. It is about choosing foods that slow glucose absorption, support insulin signaling, provide healthy fats and fiber, and create a more favorable environment for your metabolism to function. That distinction can completely change the way you approach blood sugar. Instead of asking, "What can I no longer eat?" you can begin asking a much more useful question. What can I add to this meal to help my body handle it better? That is the mindset that turns nutrition from a list of restrictions into a practical biological tool. Now that we have gone through the 10 foods, I want to take this one step further, because knowing a list of foods is useful, but understanding how those foods work together is where the real value begins. Your metabolism does not operate as a collection of isolated systems. Your pancreas, liver, muscles, digestive tract, blood vessels, and fat tissue are constantly communicating with one another through hormones, nutrients, inflammatory signals, and other biological messengers. When insulin resistance develops, that communication becomes less efficient. The pancreas may produce more insulin, the liver may release too much glucose, muscles may become less responsive to insulin, and inflammation can interfere with the signals that normally coordinate everything. This is why simply focusing on sugar itself can sometimes miss the bigger picture. The goal is not only to reduce how much glucose enters your bloodstream, the goal is also to improve what happens to that glucose once it gets there. That is where these foods become particularly interesting. The fiber-rich foods help slow the movement of glucose into your circulation. The healthy fats and proteins help create more satisfying meals and can reduce the rapid digestion that often follows highly processed foods. The omega-3 rich foods support a healthier inflammatory environment. And foods containing compounds that influence insulin signaling may help your cells become more responsive to the hormonal message they are receiving. When these changes happen repeatedly, meal after meal, they can gradually create a very different metabolic environment. That does not mean one breakfast will suddenly reverse insulin resistance. It means that thousands of small biological interactions are occurring every time you eat, and your daily food choices influence those interactions. This is also why I want you to be careful about expecting overnight miracles. Blood sugar can change quickly, but true metabolic improvement is a process. Your body has spent months or years adapting to the conditions that contributed to insulin resistance. It deserves enough time to adapt in the opposite direction as well. Think of it less like flipping a switch and more like gradually restoring sensitivity to a biological signal that has become difficult for your cells to hear. That is what makes consistency so important. If you eat a nutrient-dense meal once and then return to highly processed foods for the rest of the week, the overall pattern may not change very much. But if you repeatedly choose meals that support better glucose regulation, the cumulative effect can become meaningful. This is also where portion size matters. Even foods that are nutritious can contribute substantial calories or carbohydrates when eaten in very large amounts. The objective is not to eat unlimited quantities simply because a food is considered healthy. It is to create balanced meals in which fiber, protein, healthy fats, and minimally processed carbohydrates work together. For example, instead of thinking about a bowl of rice as something you can never eat again, consider changing the structure of the meal. Use a smaller portion of rice, add vegetables, include a protein source, and perhaps add avocado or another source of healthy fat. Now the carbohydrate is no longer arriving in isolation. Your digestive system receives a more complex mixture of nutrients, and the glucose response may become more gradual. The same principle applies to breakfast. A large bowl of sweet cereal can deliver a substantial amount of rapidly digested carbohydrate before your body has received much protein, fiber, or healthy fat. Compare that with eggs, avocado, vegetables, and perhaps a modest serving of whole grain food. The second breakfast provides a very different nutritional environment. And because it is more satisfying, it may also influence your food choices later in the morning. This is the kind of practical thinking I want you to develop. You do not have to memorize every nutritional detail. Instead, learn to recognize patterns. Ask yourself whether your meal contains enough fiber. Ask whether you have a meaningful source of protein. Ask whether the carbohydrates are minimally processed or highly refined. And ask whether the meal contains healthy fats that can improve satiety and slow digestion. These simple questions can transform the way you build your plate. Now, let me tell you about someone I will call Donna. Donna was 63 years old when she came to see me, and she had recently retired. She was understandably concerned about her health because her fasting blood sugar had been consistently around 180 milligrams per deciliter. Her physician was beginning to discuss adding a second diabetes medication, and Donna was worried about what that might mean for her future. But her concern was not only about the number on the glucose meter. She had watched her own mother struggle with diabetes for many years. Eventually, her mother experienced serious complications, including the loss of several toes and significant damage to her vision. Donna was afraid that she was heading toward the same outcome. She wanted to know whether there were practical changes she could make before her condition became even more difficult to manage. What we did was not put her on an extreme diet. We did not ask her to eliminate every carbohydrate, skip meals, or live on a list of foods she disliked. Instead, we focused on changing the quality and structure of the meals she was already eating. Her breakfast was the first major adjustment. She moved away from sugary cereal and began eating whole eggs together with avocado. That gave her breakfast more protein, healthy fat, and fiber, while dramatically reducing the amount of rapidly digested carbohydrate she had been consuming first thing in the morning. Before larger meals that contained carbohydrates, she began using diluted apple cider vinegar as part of her routine after discussing the approach with her healthcare team. White rice, which had been a regular part of her meals, was gradually replaced with lentils several times a week. The cookies she normally reached for in the afternoon were replaced with a small serving of walnuts. Fatty fish became part of dinner twice each week. She also began using Ceylon cinnamon with some of her morning meals and adding broccoli sprouts to salads and sandwiches whenever they were available. None of these changes was particularly dramatic by itself. That was the point. We were building a routine she could realistically maintain. Within the first week, she began seeing her fasting glucose readings move in a more favorable direction. Over the following months, she continued monitoring her numbers while working closely with her physician. Eventually, her glucose control improved enough that the second medication that had been under consideration was no longer necessary. Her A1C also moved downward toward a healthier range. But the most important part of her story was not the speed of the initial change. It was the fact that she could continue the habits without feeling as though she was constantly dieting. 2 years later, she was still maintaining the same general eating pattern and continued to have much better glucose control. She had not starved herself. She had not removed every carbohydrate from her diet, and she had not depended on a short-term cleanse or extreme restriction. She had simply created a nutritional environment that made it easier for her body to regulate glucose. Now, I want to be careful about what this story does and does not mean. Donna's experience is an example, not a promise. Your response will depend on your genetics, medications, activity level, sleep, body composition, existing medical conditions, and many other factors. A person with diabetes should never assume that the same foods will produce exactly the same result. But her experience demonstrates an important principle. Small, sustainable changes can become powerful when they are repeated consistently. And the reason they can work is not mysterious. Each food is influencing a different part of the metabolic system. Fiber-rich foods slow the release of glucose. Healthy fats and protein help create more stable and satisfying meals. Fatty fish, walnuts, and chia seeds provide nutrients that support a healthier inflammatory environment. Cinnamon and other plant compounds may influence insulin signaling, and minimally processed carbohydrates, such as lentils, provide energy while delivering substantial fiber and protein at the same time. This is what makes the approach fundamentally different from simply telling someone to eat less sugar. Reducing added sugar can certainly be useful, but glucose regulation involves much more than avoiding sweets. It involves how quickly carbohydrates are digested, how the liver manages glucose, how muscles take up glucose, how insulin communicates with cells, and how inflammation influences those signals. When you improve several of those factors simultaneously, the overall system can begin functioning more efficiently. This is also where the concept of insulin sensitivity becomes important. When someone has insulin resistance, the cells have essentially become less responsive to insulin's message. Imagine turning up the volume on a speaker because the listener is struggling to hear. At first, increasing the volume may help, but if the problem continues, you may keep increasing the volume without solving the underlying issue. In the same way, the pancreas can produce more insulin in an attempt to overcome cellular resistance. For a while, this may help keep blood sugar within a relatively normal range, but eventually, the system can become increasingly strained. That is why improving insulin sensitivity is so important. You are not simply trying to force more insulin into the system. You are trying to help the cells respond better to the insulin that is already present. Exercise plays a major role in this process as well, because active muscles can take up glucose and improve insulin sensitivity. Sleep matters too. Chronic sleep deprivation can interfere with metabolic regulation and make glucose control more difficult. Stress is another factor because prolonged stress responses can influence hormones that raise blood glucose. So food is powerful, but food does not operate in isolation. A person can eat all 10 of these foods and still struggle with blood sugar if they are severely sleep deprived, physically inactive, chronically stressed, or taking medications that affect glucose regulation. That is why I want you to think about these foods as pieces of a larger metabolic strategy rather than as miracle ingredients. And there is another biological system that deserves our attention because it is closely connected to blood sugar, cardiovascular health, and the way your body responds to metabolic stress. I am talking about your blood vessels. The inner lining of your arteries, the endothelium, is constantly sensing what is happening in your bloodstream. It responds to glucose, insulin, inflammatory signals, blood pressure, nutrients, and blood flow. When blood sugar remains elevated for long periods, the endothelial cells can be exposed to metabolic stress. Over time, that can interfere with normal vascular function. This is one reason diabetes is not simply a disease of sugar. It is a condition that can influence nearly every part of the cardiovascular system. The tiny blood vessels supplying your eyes, kidneys, nerves, and other tissues are particularly vulnerable to prolonged metabolic stress. That is why improving glucose control is about much more than getting a better number on a glucose meter. You are protecting the biological environment in which your entire body has to function. And this brings us back to the foods we have been discussing. Walnuts, fatty fish, chia seeds, avocado, vegetables, and other whole foods can contribute to a dietary pattern that supports cardiovascular health as well as glucose regulation. That is an important distinction because the best metabolic strategy is rarely one that targets only one measurement. The goal should be to improve the overall health of the system. As insulin sensitivity improves, glucose regulation may become easier. As the quality of your diet improves, inflammation may decrease. As your meals become more satisfying, processed snacks may become less appealing. As your blood sugar becomes more stable, you may experience fewer extreme swings in hunger and energy. And when these changes reinforce one another, healthy habits can become easier to maintain. That is the real power of a sustainable approach. You are not relying on willpower every minute of every day. You are designing your environment so that healthier choices become easier and more natural. But before you begin making significant changes, there is one safety issue I want you to understand clearly. If you are currently taking insulin or certain medications known as sulfonylureas, these nutritional changes may affect your glucose levels more than you expect. As your body becomes more efficient at handling glucose, a medication dose that was previously appropriate may become too strong. That can increase the risk of hypoglycemia, which means your blood sugar becomes dangerously low. For that reason, people using glucose-lowering medication should monitor their readings carefully when making major dietary changes and should stay in contact with their healthcare provider. Do not stop, reduce, or replace a prescribed medication on your own. Instead, bring the foods and strategies you are considering to your next appointment and discuss how they fit into your treatment plan. Your physician can help determine whether your medications need adjustment as your glucose levels change. That is how nutrition and medicine should work together. It is not an either-or decision. The goal is to give your body every appropriate tool available while keeping you safe. And once you understand that, the next question becomes very practical. How do you actually begin? Because knowing 10 foods is one thing. Turning them into a routine is something else entirely. You do not need to introduce all 10 foods tomorrow. In fact, I would rather you make a few changes that you can maintain than attempt 10 changes at once and abandon them after a week. Start with one meal. If breakfast is your most difficult meal, replace a sugary cereal or pastry with eggs and avocado. If lunch is where you tend to experience a large glucose rise, consider replacing part of a refined carbohydrate with lentils and adding vegetables and protein. If afternoon snacking is your weakness, keep a small portion of walnuts available instead of relying on cookies or chips. If you rarely eat fish, choose one affordable option such as canned sardines and begin incorporating it into one meal each week before working toward 2 servings. If you want to try chia seeds, add a small amount to yogurt or oatmeal rather than suddenly consuming a large quantity. And if you use cinnamon regularly, choose Ceylon cinnamon for everyday use rather than assuming all cinnamon is identical. These are small decisions, but repeated small decisions are exactly how long-term habits are built. The same principle applies to fenugreek and broccoli sprouts. You do not need to turn your kitchen into a laboratory. You simply need to introduce foods gradually and observe how your body responds. If you monitor your glucose, your meter can provide useful information about your personal response. You may notice that certain meals produce a much smaller glucose rise when you combine them with fiber, protein, and healthy fats. That information can become a powerful learning tool. Instead of guessing what works for your body, you can begin observing patterns. And when you understand those patterns, food becomes much less confusing. You are no longer simply following a list of forbidden foods. You are learning how your own metabolism responds to different combinations of nutrients. That is a much more empowering approach to long-term health. There is one more part of this discussion that I want you to understand, because it may completely change the way you interpret your morning glucose reading. I frequently hear people say, "Doctor, I understand why my blood sugar rises after I eat dessert or a large meal, but why is my highest reading sometimes the first one I take in the morning when I have not eaten anything all night?" It seems confusing at first. If you have been fasting for 8 or 10 hours, it is natural to assume that your blood sugar should automatically be at its lowest point. But your body does not simply stop managing glucose while you sleep. In fact, during the night, one of the most important metabolic organs in your body is actively working to keep enough fuel available for your brain and other tissues. That organ is your liver. Your liver is essentially a glucose management center. It stores glucose in the form of glycogen and can release that stored energy when your body needs it. It can also produce new glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. This is a completely normal and necessary biological function. Your brain continues using energy while you sleep. Your heart continues beating, your lungs continue working, and your cells continue performing thousands of essential processes even though you are not eating. Your body therefore needs a way to maintain an adequate energy supply throughout the night. The liver helps accomplish that by releasing glucose into the bloodstream in carefully regulated amounts. Under healthy metabolic conditions, insulin and other hormones help keep this process under control. But when insulin resistance develops, that regulation can become less precise. Your liver may receive signals telling it to release more glucose than your body actually needs. And because you are asleep and not eating, you may have no idea that this is happening. You simply wake up, check your glucose, and see a number that seems completely disconnected from what you ate the previous evening. This is one reason fasting blood sugar can remain stubbornly high even when someone is making significant improvements to their diet. The problem is not always what happened at dinner. Sometimes the answer is what happened inside the liver several hours later. There is also a natural hormonal pattern that occurs in the early morning hours. As your body prepares to wake up, hormones such as cortisol, growth hormone, adrenaline, and others begin shifting. These hormones help increase alertness and prepare you to become active, but they can also signal the liver to make more glucose available. This phenomenon is often referred to as the dawn phenomenon. In a person with healthy insulin sensitivity, the body can usually handle this temporary increase in glucose production without creating a major elevation in blood sugar. But if insulin resistance is significant, the additional glucose released by the liver may remain in the bloodstream instead of moving efficiently into cells. The result can be a surprisingly high fasting reading in the morning. This is why I do not want you to look at your fasting glucose as if it were simply a report card on what you ate the night before. It is a snapshot of a much larger biological process. Your previous meals matter, of course. Your physical activity matters. Your sleep matters. Your stress levels matter. Your medications matter. And your liver's overnight glucose production matters too. All of these factors come together to produce the number you see on your glucose meter in the morning. This is also why simply eating less at dinner does not always solve the problem. Some people respond by skipping dinner, drastically restricting carbohydrates, or going to bed hungry because they assume that an empty stomach must automatically produce a lower fasting glucose reading. But the body is more sophisticated than that. If you are not eating, your liver can still produce glucose. In fact, that is one of its most important jobs. So the goal should not be to starve the body of glucose. The goal is to improve the signals that tell the liver how much glucose is actually needed. And this brings us back to insulin sensitivity. When your cells become more responsive to insulin, your body can manage glucose more efficiently. Your muscles can take up more glucose. Your liver can respond more appropriately to insulin's signals, and your overall glucose regulation can become more stable. This is one reason why the foods we discussed earlier are not simply about lowering the number you see after a meal. They can contribute to a broader metabolic environment that supports better regulation throughout the day and night. Fiber can slow glucose absorption. Healthy fats can improve meal composition and satiety. Protein can help stabilize meals and reduce unnecessary snacking. Plant compounds can influence cellular pathways. And omega-3 rich foods can contribute to a healthier inflammatory environment. Together, these factors can support the systems responsible for keeping glucose within an appropriate range. But there is another strategy that deserves attention here, and it does not come from the kitchen at all. It comes from movement. Your skeletal muscles are one of the largest destinations for glucose in your body. When your muscles contract during physical activity, they can increase glucose uptake through pathways that do not depend entirely on insulin. That is a remarkable feature of human physiology. It means that physical activity can help your muscles pull glucose out of the bloodstream even when insulin sensitivity is not perfect. You do not necessarily need an intense workout to benefit from this process. A walk after a meal can be surprisingly useful. When you move your muscles after eating, you give those muscles an opportunity to use some of the glucose that has just entered your circulation. That can reduce the size and duration of the post-meal glucose rise. For someone who has been sedentary, even a short walk can represent a meaningful improvement over remaining seated for hours. Of course, the appropriate amount and intensity of exercise depends on your age, fitness level, medications, and medical conditions. But the principle is simple. Your muscles are metabolically active tissue, and using them regularly gives your body another pathway for managing glucose. This is also why resistance training can be valuable. Building and maintaining muscle gives your body more tissue capable of storing and using glucose. As people age, muscle mass naturally tends to decline unless we actively work to preserve it. That decline can contribute to worsening insulin sensitivity over time. Strength training, when appropriate and performed safely, can therefore support both physical function and metabolic health. This does not mean you need to become an athlete. It means that your muscles are part of your glucose management system, and keeping them active is one of the most practical things you can do. Now let's return to food, because there is another concept that can make all of these recommendations much easier to understand. Food does not simply contain calories. Food contains information. Every meal sends signals throughout your body. The nutrients you consume interact with your gut, your hormones, your immune system, your liver, your muscles, and your blood vessels. Fiber changes what happens inside the digestive tract. Protein influences satiety and hormonal signaling. Fat changes digestion and provides essential building blocks for cells. Plant compounds can interact with cellular pathways involved in inflammation and metabolism. And the combination of these nutrients can influence how quickly glucose appears in your bloodstream. This is why two meals containing the same number of calories can produce very different metabolic responses. A highly processed meal containing refined carbohydrates and added sugars can be digested rapidly, creating a substantial glucose and insulin response. A meal containing vegetables, legumes, protein, healthy fats, and minimally processed carbohydrates may contain a similar amount of energy, but can create a much slower and more stable response. This is one of the most important ideas I want you to take away from this video. Do not judge a food only by whether it contains carbohydrates, fat, or calories. Ask what the entire food matrix looks like. How much fiber does it contain? How processed is it? What nutrients accompany the carbohydrate? How quickly is it likely to be digested? And what happens when you combine it with protein, vegetables, and healthy fat? These questions are much more useful than simply labeling a food as good or bad. And they allow you to build meals rather than simply eliminate ingredients. That is why lentils can be such a valuable carbohydrate source. That is why an avocado can change the way a meal behaves. That is why chia seeds can slow digestion. And that is why replacing refined snacks with walnuts can alter the entire nutritional profile of your afternoon. The common theme is not that these foods magically lower glucose. The common theme is that they create conditions in which your body can manage glucose more effectively. Now, I also want to address something that often gets overlooked when people begin changing their diet. Do not expect every glucose reading to improve in a straight line. Blood sugar naturally fluctuates. You may have a better reading one morning and a higher reading the next, even if you ate similar foods. Sleep quality can change. Stress can change. Physical activity can change. Illness can temporarily raise glucose. Medications can affect it. And even the timing of your meals and glucose testing can influence the number you see. That is why it is much more useful to look for patterns over time rather than becoming emotionally attached to a single reading. If your fasting glucose is 150 one morning and 135 the next, that does not necessarily mean your entire metabolism transformed overnight. Likewise, if you have one higher reading after several good days, it does not mean your strategy has failed. The body is constantly adapting. Look at trends. Look at your weekly patterns. Pay attention to how your glucose responds to specific meals. And when you are working with a physician, bring those patterns with you. They can provide much more useful information than one isolated number. There is also a very practical reason to pay attention to what happens after meals. Post-meal glucose excursions can contribute substantially to overall glucose exposure throughout the day. If you repeatedly experience very large rises after breakfast, lunch, and dinner, those repeated elevations can contribute to your overall metabolic burden, even if your fasting number looks relatively acceptable. This is another reason meal composition matters. You are not simply trying to lower one measurement. You are trying to reduce unnecessary glucose exposure across the entire day. And that is where the foods we have discussed can become useful. Instead of eliminating every carbohydrate, you can pair carbohydrates with fiber, protein, and healthy fats. Instead of relying on refined snacks, you can choose walnuts or another whole food option. Instead of a breakfast dominated by rapidly digested carbohydrates, you can build a meal around eggs, vegetables, avocado, or another source of protein and healthy fat. Instead of always using white rice or refined starches, you can experiment with lentils, beans, or other minimally processed carbohydrate sources. These are not complicated strategies. They simply require a shift in how you think about your plate. And over time, those choices can become automatic. You no longer have to debate every meal. You begin to recognize what a balanced plate looks like. You understand that carbohydrates can remain part of a healthy diet when you choose their sources carefully and combine them intelligently. You also begin to understand that your body needs carbohydrates for many important functions. The brain uses glucose. Muscles use glucose. Red blood cells depend heavily on glucose. The objective is not to eliminate this essential fuel. The objective is to regulate how much enters your bloodstream, how quickly it arrives, and how efficiently your tissues can use it. That is the real difference between carbohydrate avoidance and metabolic health. One focuses on fear, the other focuses on biology, and when you understand the biology, food becomes much less frightening. You can make informed decisions instead of following rigid rules that may not fit your individual needs. This is particularly important as we get older. Metabolism changes with age. Muscle mass can decline. Physical activity often decreases. Sleep can become less consistent, and insulin sensitivity may gradually worsen. But aging does not mean that metabolic decline is inevitable or that nothing can be done. The body remains remarkably adaptable. Muscle responds to resistance training. Insulin sensitivity can improve with physical activity and healthier nutrition. The gut responds to changes in dietary fiber. Blood vessels respond to changes in blood flow and metabolic conditions. And the liver responds to the hormonal environment created by your overall lifestyle. This capacity for adaptation is one of the most encouraging aspects of human biology. You do not need perfection to influence it. You need consistency. And consistency begins with changes that are realistic enough to maintain. That is why I do not want you to leave this video thinking you need to completely rebuild your life tomorrow morning. Choose 1 or 2 changes first. Make them routine. Then build from there. If you are successful with eggs and avocado at breakfast, keep that habit. If lentils become your preferred replacement for refined starches, use them regularly. If walnuts become your afternoon snack, keep them available. If you enjoy salmon or sardines, make them part of your weekly meals. If chia seeds work well for your digestion, add them consistently. And if you are monitoring your blood sugar, use your readings as information rather than judgment. Your glucose meter is not there to tell you whether you are a good or bad person. It is simply giving you data about what your body is doing. That data can help you make better decisions, especially when interpreted alongside your physician's guidance. And there is one final piece of the puzzle that I want you to understand before we bring everything together. If your fasting glucose remains high, even after you have improved your diet, do not immediately assume that you have failed. There may be other factors involved, particularly the way your liver behaves overnight. That morning rise in glucose can be frustrating, but it has a biological explanation. Understanding that explanation can help you approach the problem much more intelligently. And that is exactly where I want to take you next. If you wake up every morning and see a fasting blood sugar number that is higher than you expected, I want you to remember that this does not automatically mean you ate the wrong food the night before, or that your entire approach has failed. Your liver may be contributing to that morning rise, and understanding what happens during those overnight hours can change the way you approach your metabolic health. While you sleep, your body is not inactive. Your liver continues producing and releasing glucose because your brain, heart, and other tissues still require energy even though you are not eating. When insulin sensitivity is healthy, insulin helps keep that glucose production under control. But when insulin resistance is present, the liver can become less responsive to insulin's signal and may release more glucose than your body needs. As morning approaches, hormones that help prepare you to wake up can further encourage glucose production. This is why someone can fast all night and still wake up with an elevated glucose reading. It is not necessarily a contradiction. It is your metabolism doing what it has been designed to do, but under conditions where the normal regulatory signals are no longer working as efficiently as they should. And this is one more reason why improving insulin sensitivity is so important. You are not simply trying to prevent glucose from entering your bloodstream. You are helping your body become better at controlling glucose once it is there. That means supporting the pancreas, improving the responsiveness of your muscles, helping the liver respond appropriately to insulin, reducing unnecessary inflammation, and choosing meals that deliver glucose at a manageable rate. This is where the 10 foods we discussed become part of a much larger strategy. Fenugreek provides soluble fiber that can slow carbohydrate absorption. Ceylon cinnamon contains plant compounds that have been studied for their potential influence on insulin signaling. Broccoli sprouts provide sulforaphane and other compounds that may influence pathways involved in metabolic regulation. Avocado provides monounsaturated fat and fiber that can make a meal more satisfying and slow digestion. Chia seeds provide soluble fiber and plant-based omega-3 fats. Fatty fish provide EPA and DHA, two long-chain omega-3 fatty acids associated with cardiovascular and metabolic health. Walnuts provide healthy fats, fiber, protein, and plant compounds that support both metabolic and vascular health. Whole eggs provide protein and healthy fats with very little carbohydrate. Apple cider vinegar contains acetic acid, which has been studied for its ability to reduce the post-meal glucose response in some circumstances. And lentils provide a combination of resistant starch, fiber, and plant protein that allows a carbohydrate-rich food to behave very differently from refined starches. Notice something important about this list. Not one of these foods is being presented as a magic cure. That is not how human metabolism works. A single food cannot erase years of insulin resistance, replace physical activity, compensate for severe sleep deprivation, or substitute for appropriate medical treatment. But a consistent dietary pattern can influence many of the biological pathways that determine how your body handles glucose, and that is where the real opportunity lies. The most powerful changes are often the ones that seem almost too simple to matter. Replacing a sugary breakfast with eggs and avocado. Choosing lentils instead of refined starch several times a week. Keeping walnuts available when you are hungry in the afternoon. Adding vegetables and fiber to meals. Eating fatty fish regularly. Walking after meals instead of remaining seated. Getting enough sleep. Managing stress. And monitoring your glucose so you can understand how your own body responds. None of these actions is dramatic, but metabolic health is built through repeated signals. Every meal is a signal. Every walk is a signal. Every night of adequate sleep is a signal. Every period of physical activity tells your muscles and metabolism something about what your body needs to be able to do. Over time, those signals can begin moving your physiology in a healthier direction. That is why I want you to stop thinking about blood sugar control as a battle against food. Food is not your enemy. Your body is not your enemy. And carbohydrates are not automatically your enemy either. The real issue is whether the foods you choose support or interfere with the biological systems responsible for glucose regulation. A whole lentil is not metabolically equivalent to a refined piece of white bread. An avocado is not metabolically equivalent to a sugary pastry simply because both contain calories. A handful of walnuts is not equivalent to a package of sweetened cookies. The structure of the food matters. The nutrients surrounding the carbohydrate matter. The degree of processing matters. The amount you eat matters. And the pattern of your entire diet matters even more. This is why I encourage you to think in terms of additions rather than deprivation. Instead of asking yourself, what am I allowed to eat? Ask, what can I add to this meal to make it more supportive of my metabolism? Could you add vegetables? Could you include a source of protein? Could you replace refined carbohydrates with lentils or another high-fiber carbohydrate? Could you add avocado or another source of healthy fat? Could you choose nuts instead of processed snacks? And these questions are much more practical than simply creating a long list of forbidden foods. And because they are practical, they are more likely to become habits. Now, there is something else I want to emphasize if you are currently taking medication for diabetes or another condition affecting your blood glucose. Please do not interpret anything in this discussion as a reason to stop or reduce your medication on your own. If you use insulin or medications such as sulfonylureas, improving your diet and becoming more physically active can sometimes lower your glucose more effectively than expected. That can be a positive development, but it also means your medication requirements may eventually need to change. The safe way to handle that is through monitoring and communication with your physician. Your doctor can evaluate your glucose readings, A1C, medication doses, kidney function, other health conditions, and overall risk before deciding whether treatment should be adjusted. Never assume that a lower glucose reading means you should immediately change your medication dose yourself. The goal is controlled improvement, not sudden fluctuations. And if you have diabetes, especially if you use insulin, You should know the signs of low blood sugar and understand how to respond according to the plan provided by your healthcare team. Nutrition should work together with medicine, not compete with it. Now, if you want to begin tomorrow, keep it simple. You do not need a perfect meal plan. You do not need an expensive collection of supplements. And you certainly do not need to throw away everything in your kitchen tonight. Choose one improvement for breakfast. Perhaps replace sugary cereal with whole eggs and avocado. Choose one improvement for lunch or dinner. Perhaps use lentils in place of some of the refined starch on your plate. Choose one improvement for snacking. Keep a small serving of walnuts available instead of reaching automatically for processed foods. Then look at your weekly routine. Can you include fatty fish twice a week? Can you add chia seeds to a meal you already enjoy? Can you include broccoli sprouts in salads or sandwiches? Can you use Ceylon cinnamon in your oatmeal or coffee? And if apple cider vinegar is appropriate for you, could you discuss its use with your healthcare provider before making it a regular habit? You do not need to implement everything at once. In fact, gradual change is often the smarter strategy. When you introduce one or two habits at a time, you can learn how your body responds. You can also determine which habits fit naturally into your lifestyle and which ones are difficult to maintain. That matters because the best diet is not necessarily the one that looks perfect on paper. It is the one you can realistically continue for years. A nutrition plan that you follow for 10 days and then abandon is far less useful than a simple plan you can maintain for 5 years. Long-term metabolic health is built through repetition. And repetition becomes much easier when your meals are satisfying, affordable, enjoyable, and realistic. That is why I am much more interested in sustainable changes than extreme diets. Your metabolism does not need punishment, it needs support. Your cells do not need starvation. They need the right signals. Your pancreas does not need to be forced into working harder indefinitely. Your tissues need to become more responsive to the insulin your body is already producing. Your liver needs appropriate signals about how much glucose to release. Your muscles need regular movement so they can continue acting as an important destination for glucose. And your blood vessels need an environment that minimizes unnecessary metabolic stress. When you look at health through that biological lens, food becomes much more interesting. A meal is no longer simply calories on a plate. It is a collection of signals interacting with your physiology. Fiber communicates with your digestive system. Healthy fats interact with cell membranes and influence satiety. Protein helps maintain muscle and regulate appetite. Plant compounds can influence cellular pathways. Omega-3 fatty acids participate in processes involved in cardiovascular and inflammatory regulation. And the combination of all these nutrients can influence the speed and magnitude of your glucose response. This is why I want you to remember the central message of this entire video. Improving blood sugar is not simply about taking something away. It is often about adding the right things consistently. Add fiber, add vegetables, add protein, add healthy fats, add minimally processed carbohydrates, add movement, add sleep, add consistency, and gradually you may find that your body becomes better equipped to regulate glucose without requiring you to live in fear of every carbohydrate you eat. That is the deeper lesson. You are not trying to create a body that never experiences a rise in blood sugar. That would not be normal. Blood glucose is supposed to rise after meals. What matters is how high it rises, how long it remains elevated, how efficiently your tissues respond, and how effectively your body brings it back toward its normal range. Healthy metabolism is dynamic. It responds to food, movement, sleep, stress, hormones, and countless other signals. The goal is to help those systems communicate more effectively. And that takes us back to the question we started with. What if the biggest mistake people make when trying to improve their blood sugar is focusing only on what they need to stop eating? What if the better question is what they can start adding? That shift in perspective can be incredibly powerful. Because when you focus only on restriction, every meal can feel like a test of willpower. But when you focus on nourishment, every meal becomes an opportunity to support your biology. That does not mean you can eat unlimited amounts of any food simply because it is healthy. It does not mean medication is unnecessary, and it does not mean one particular ingredient will fix diabetes. It means you can make smarter decisions based on how your body actually works. And that is a much more sustainable way to think about metabolic health. If you are currently monitoring your fasting glucose, pay attention to your patterns over time. Look at what happens after different breakfasts. Look at what happens when you walk after dinner. Notice how your sleep affects your morning reading. Notice how stress affects your appetite and glucose, and discuss these patterns with your healthcare provider. The more information you have, the more intelligently you can approach your treatment and lifestyle choices. And if your fasting glucose remains elevated despite making positive changes, do not become discouraged. Remember the liver. Remember the dawn phenomenon. Remember that glucose regulation is a whole body process. There may be factors beyond the food you ate the night before. That is why understanding the underlying biology is so valuable. I recently created another video specifically about this morning blood sugar problem. In that discussion, I explain why your liver releases glucose during the night, why your fasting reading can rise even after many hours without food, what the dawn phenomenon has to do with those early morning numbers, and which practical strategies may help you address the underlying causes. If stubborn fasting blood sugar is one of your biggest concerns, I recommend watching that next, because it builds directly on the concepts we have explored here today. The more you understand what your body is doing, the less mysterious your glucose readings become. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to realize that your metabolism is not fixed. Your body is adaptable. Cells respond to signals. Muscles respond to movement. The liver responds to hormones and energy demands. The digestive system responds to the foods you eat, and your blood vessels respond to the metabolic environment in which they operate. That adaptability gives us an opportunity to influence our health through the choices we repeat every day. So start small. Choose one food. Choose one meal. Choose one habit. Then give your body time to respond. Build from there. Do not chase perfection. Build consistency. And if you are managing diabetes or taking glucose-lowering medication, make these changes with appropriate medical guidance and monitoring. Your health is not a race, and your blood sugar is not a number that needs to be conquered overnight. It is information. Use that information to understand your body, work with your physician, and make decisions that support your health for the long term. Thank you for spending this time with me. I appreciate your trust, and I hope this discussion has helped you see blood sugar from a different perspective. Food is not simply something you consume to satisfy hunger. It can become one of the tools you use to support the remarkable biology that keeps your body functioning every day. And when you understand that biology, the goal becomes much clearer. You are not simply trying to eat less. You are learning how to eat in a way that helps your body work better. I will see you in the next video.